"Your Honor," Mr. Patterson had said, standing with newfound confidence, "my client is prepared to present evidence that the land in question was illegally obtained through a conspiracy involving forged documents, bribed officials, and systematic fraud dating back 3 years." The courtroom had fallen silent. Karen had felt a moment of pure satisfaction, watching the faces of the people who dismissed her as a crazy woman with a grudge. They were beginning to understand that she wasn't just some unhinged homeowner. She was someone who'd spent months building an airtight case, and she was about to blow their world apart. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson had continued, "My client was acting within her legal rights as the rightful owner of the property in question. The lake was artificially maintained on her land without her consent. She had every right to drain it." Judge Morrison had looked between the lawyers, the packed courtroom, and the stack of documents on his desk. "This case is remanded to civil court for property disputes. Criminal charges are suspended pending resolution of the ownership question." Karen had felt the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in months. She'd won the first round. 3 months later, Karen stood in the same spot where she'd been arrested, but now she was holding a different set of documents. The settlement agreement was thick enough to use as a doorstop, and every page represented another victory in her war against the Willowbrook HOA. $60 million, Mark had said, reading over her shoulder. He'd come back 2 weeks ago, sheepish and apologetic, admitting that he'd been wrong to doubt her. "Karen, you're rich." "We're rich," she'd corrected, though part of her wondered if they'd ever really recover from the months of separation and stress. "And more importantly, we're right." The investigation had unraveled faster than a cheap sweater. Once the FBI got involved, they'd found a pattern of corruption that stretched back 5 years and involved dozens of illegal developments across 3 counties. Richard Blackwood was facing federal charges. The city planning commissioner had already pleaded guilty to accepting bribes. And Mrs. Henderson, well, Mrs. Henderson had moved in with her sister in Florida and refused to speak to reporters. "What are you going to do with all this?" Mark had asked, gesturing toward the empty lake bed, where construction crews were already working to restore the original wetland. Karen had looked out over the land that had cost her so much to reclaim. Her grandmother's apple orchard would be replanted in the spring. The lake would be restored to its natural boundaries. And in the center of it all, she was building a new house, not a mansion, just a simple farmhouse with a wraparound porch and room for the vegetable garden she'd always wanted. "I'm going to live," she'd said simply, "and I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The Whitmore Foundation for Property Rights had been her lawyer's idea, but Karen had embraced it wholeheartedly. The foundation would provide legal aid to homeowners fighting property fraud, fund investigative journalism into development corruption, and lobbied for stricter oversight of HOA powers. "You know they're calling you the HOA Slayer on social media," her daughter Emma had said during one of their video calls. Emma was a freshman at college, and Karen could hear the pride in her voice. "You've got like 1 million followers." Karen had laughed, remembering the woman she'd been just 6 months ago, the one who'd measured grass height and filed noise complaints. "I never wanted to be famous, sweetheart. I just wanted what was right." "Mom," Emma had said seriously, "you didn't just fight for what was right. You won. You actually won." Standing in the restored wetland, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Karen had to admit her daughter was right. She'd won more than just money or land. She'd won something that couldn't be bought or stolen. The knowledge that sometimes, if you're smart enough and stubborn enough and willing to risk everything, you can actually beat the system. Her phone buzzed with a text from her new lawyer, the high-powered attorney who'd taken over her case when it became clear she was going to win. "Karen, just got off the phone with the state ag's office. They want to discuss the Riverside development case. Looks like you're about to have company in the property fraud business." Karen had smiled, looking out over the land that had been worth fighting for. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of construction equipment working to restore what had been destroyed. It was a good sound, she'd decided. The sound of things being made right. She'd started walking back toward her temporary trailer when Mark was making dinner and planning their new life. But as she walked, she'd noticed something that made her pause. Fresh survey stakes had been driven into the ground near the eastern boundary of her property. Someone was planning to build again. Karen had pulled out her phone and taken a photo of the stakes, then forwarded it to her lawyer with a simple message. "Looks like we're not done yet." The fight for her land might be over, but Karen was beginning to understand that the fight for justice was never really finished. There would always be another corrupt developer, another forged document, another family about to lose everything to someone with more money and fewer scruples. But now there was also Karen Whitmore, the woman who drained a lake to prove a point. And she was just getting started. The 911 calls had started at 6:47 am, when jogger Patricia Mills discovered that Sunset Lake had vanished overnight, leaving behind a muddy crater dotted with tilting houses. By 7:15, news vans were arriving. By 8:30, Karen was in handcuffs, being loaded into a police car while photographers captured every moment. This is Karen Whitmore, the woman who single-handedly drained Sunset Lake, Channel 7's morning anchor announced breathlessly. Homeowners are calling it an act of terrorism. Legal experts are calling it the most expensive property dispute in county history. Karen had watched the coverage from her holding cell, oddly fascinated by seeing herself on television. The woman on screen looked nothing like the person she'd been 6 months ago. This Karen had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. This Karen had actually done something about the injustice instead of just filing complaints and hoping the system would work. "Mrs. Whitmore," her court-appointed lawyer had said during their first meeting, "I have to ask, do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? We're talking about $35 million in property damage." Karen had leaned back in her chair, surprisingly calm for someone facing multiple felony charges. "Mr. Patterson, do you understand the magnitude of what was done to me? We're talking about 60 acres of land worth $40 million, stolen through forged documents and bribed officials." The lawyer had shuffled through his papers nervously. That's a civil matter. What you did, draining the lake, that's criminal. Is it?" Karen had pulled out her waterproof bag, now slightly damp but still intact. "Because according to the 1958 Dam Maintenance Agreement, I have the legal right to control water levels on my property for agricultural and maintenance purposes. I was maintaining my property by removing the artificial lake that was enabling trespassers." Mr. Patterson had stared at the document she handed him, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something that might have been professional admiration. "My God, you actually researched this." "I researched everything," Karen had replied. "The property deeds, the water rights, the environmental impact studies. I even researched the statute of limitations on property theft. Did you know that in this state, you can't claim adverse possession on land that was obtained through fraud?" The lawyer had looked up from the documents, his expression suddenly very serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you telling me you have evidence that the original land transfer was fraudulent?" Karen had smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Patterson, I have evidence that will make your career. The question is, are you ready to take on the biggest property law case in state history?" The preliminary hearing had been a circus. The courtroom was packed with displaced homeowners, their lawyers, reporters, and curiosity seekers who'd driven from 3 counties away to see the woman who drained the lake. Karen had sat at the defendant's table, wearing her best suit and the same calm expression she'd worn in her holding cell. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Janet Walsh had begun, "the defendant has caused catastrophic damage to private property. 35 families are now homeless because of her reckless actions. The state is seeking charges of criminal mischief, vandalism, and reckless endangerment." Judge Morrison had looked down at Karen with the weary expression of a man who'd seen everything. "Mrs. Whitmore, how do you plead?" Karen had stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "Not guilty, Your Honor. And I'd like to file a countersuit for grand theft, fraud, and racketeering against the Willowbrook HOA, Blackwood Development, and the City Planning Commission." The courtroom had erupted. Mrs. Henderson had screamed something about Karen being a terrorist. Richard Blackwood had shouted about frivolous lawsuits. The judge had pounded his gavel so hard Karen was surprised it didn't break. Order, Judge Morrison had bellowed. This is a preliminary hearing, not a three-ring circus. But Karen had seen what she'd needed to see. She'd seen the flash of panic in Blackwood's eyes, the way the city attorney had suddenly started taking notes, the whispered conversations between lawyers who just realized this case was about to become much more complicated than they'd anticipated. Karen Whitmore stood ankle-deep in what used to be Sunset Lake, clutching a soggy legal document that had cost her $3,000 and 6 months of her life to obtain. The morning sun glinted off the exposed lakebed, where 35 McMansions now sat like beached whales, their foundations cracked and tilting at impossible angles. "Ma'am, you can't be here," called Deputy Martinez from the shore, his voice carrying across the muddy wasteland. "This is a crime scene." Karen turned slowly, her designer boots squelching in the muck. "Crime scene? Deputy, I am the crime scene." She held up the document, water dripping from its laminated edges. "This is my land, every square inch of it." The deputy squinted at her, probably trying to figure out if she was another disaster tourist or genuinely unhinged. Karen understood the confusion. 3 days ago, she'd been just another suburban mom with a penchant for filing noise complaints and measuring grass height with a ruler. Now she was standing in a drained lake, surrounded by millions of dollars in damaged property, with the entire Willowbrook HOA board threatening to sue her into oblivion. "The dam," Deputy Martinez said carefully, "the one that's been holding back Sunset Lake for 40 years. You're saying you opened it?" Karen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Opened it? Deputy, I didn't just open it. I took a sledgehammer to every single mechanism keeping that water in place. Took me 4 hours and 3 energy drinks, but I got the job done." The deputy's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. "Ma'am, that's destruction of property. Multiple felonies. You're looking at..." "At what?" "Defending my own land." Karen's voice rose, echoing across the empty lake bed. "Those houses, every single one of them is built on property that's been in my family for 60 years. The HOA forged documents, bribed inspectors, and bulldozed my grandmother's apple orchard to build their little suburban paradise. They thought I'd roll over and take it." She gestured toward the nearest house, a gaudy colonial with fake shutters and a 3-car garage that was now tilting like a drunk sailor. "Mrs. Henderson in that monstrosity. She's been filing complaints about my unsightly vegetable garden for 2 years. Said it was bringing down property values." Karen's smile was predatory. "Well, I guess property values just took a real dive." The deputy looked between Karen and the destruction surrounding them. "Ma'am, people lived in those houses. Families. Where are they supposed to go?" Karen's expression flickered for just a moment, something that might have been regret crossing her features. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the steel resolve that had carried her through months of legal battles and sleepless nights, researching property law. "They should have thought about that before they built on stolen land," she said quietly. "Every single one of them knew those houses were going up too fast, too cheap, and in the wrong place. They just didn't care because it wasn't their problem." The deputy was definitely reaching for his radio now. Karen didn't try to stop him. She'd known this moment would come. Hell, she'd planned for it. The difference was she'd spent the last 6 months making sure she'd have the last laugh. "Tell me, deputy," she said, walking toward shore with her hands already rising in surrender. "What exactly are you going to charge me with?" "Draining water off my own property." Karen spent 2 weeks studying the dam like a doctoral student cramming for finals. She read engineering reports from the 1930s, environmental impact studies from the 1970s, and maintenance logs that went back 40 years. She learned about water pressure, structural integrity, and the precise sequence of events that would drain Sunset Lake in the most dramatic way possible. "You're scaring me," her neighbor Janet had said, finding Karen measuring water levels at dawn for the 3rd day in a row. "People are talking. They think you're planning something." Karen had looked up from her notebook, where she'd been calculating drainage times and water volume. Let them talk. They should have thought about that before they built their dream homes on stolen land. The beauty of her plan was its legal simplicity. The dam maintenance agreement, filed with the county in 1958, gave the primary landowner the right to control water levels for agricultural, recreational, and property maintenance purposes. Karen's lawyer had missed it completely, probably because it was buried in a file box that hadn't been digitized. But Karen had found it, and more importantly, she'd found the loophole. The lake is artificial, she'd explained to Mark during one of their increasingly tense phone calls. It only exists because of the dam. If I remove the dam, the lake disappears, and suddenly all those houses are sitting on dry land that clearly belongs to me. Karen, please, Mark had pleaded. This is insane. You're talking about destroying people's lives. They destroyed mine first, Karen had replied, and she'd meant it. The stress of the legal battle had cost her sleep, her savings, and her marriage. Mark had moved out the previous week, taking the kids to his mother's house until Karen came to her senses. The night before her operation, Karen had walked through the Willowbrook Estates development one last time. She'd studied each house, memorized their features, and tried to feel some regret for what she was about to do. The houses were beautiful, she had to admit, expensive, well-built, despite being constructed on stolen land. Mrs. Henderson's house had been particularly impressive, with its wraparound porch and perfectly manicured rose garden. Karen had stood on the sidewalk, remembering all the times Mrs. Henderson had complained about Karen's unsightly vegetables, her inappropriate holiday decorations, her aggressive dandelions that dared to cross property lines. Enjoying the view? Mrs. Henderson had appeared on her porch, arms crossed, radiating hostility. Actually, yes, Karen had replied. It's a beautiful house. Shame about the foundation. What's that supposed to mean? Karen had smiled, the expression feeling foreign on her face after months of legal stress. Tomorrow, Mrs. Henderson, you're going to understand exactly what it means to build your dreams on someone else's land. She'd spent that night loading her truck with the tools she'd need: sledgehammer, crowbar, bolt cutters, and a thermos of coffee that would keep her going through the long night ahead. She'd also packed a waterproof bag with copies of every document that proved her ownership, just in case the police arrived before she was finished. The dam itself was surprisingly small, just a concrete structure with a series of gates and spillways that had been controlling water flow for decades. Karen had studied the maintenance manuals until she could disassemble the mechanism blindfolded. That actual destruction would take hours, but the result would be immediate and irreversible. At 3 a.m., Karen had driven to the dam site, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror. In a few hours, it would be empty, and 35 families would wake up to discover their homes sitting in a muddy crater. She'd felt a moment of hesitation then, thinking about the children who lived in those houses, the elderly couple in the blue colonial who'd always waved when she walked by, the young family who'd just moved in last month. But then she'd remembered her grandmother's apple trees, bulldozed to make room for Mrs. Henderson's 3-car garage. She'd thought about the legal fees that had drained her savings, the sleepless nights, the stress that had driven her family away. Karen had picked up her sledgehammer and gotten to work. The first blow had been the hardest. After that, it was just a matter of time. 6 months earlier, Karen had been the kind of woman who organized her spice rack alphabetically and kept a binder of HOA violation photos organized by address and infraction severity. She'd been the HOA board star witness, the neighbor who noticed when someone's fence was 6 inches too tall or when holiday decorations stayed up past the mandated removal date. You're becoming obsessed with this, her husband Mark had said, watching her spread surveyor maps across their dining room table for the 3rd night in a row. Maybe the HOA made a mistake, but surely we can work something out. Karen had looked up from the 1962 property deed she'd been studying, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. A mistake. Mark, they didn't make a mistake. They stole 60 acres of land and built 35 houses on it. That's not a mistake, that's fraud. It had started with a letter, a simple notice that the city was updating property boundaries and that she needed to verify her lot lines. Karen, ever the diligent homeowner, had ordered a proper survey. What she'd found had turned her world upside down. The land where the newest section of Willowbrook Estate sat, all those beautiful homes with their manicured lawns and matching mailboxes, belonged to her. More specifically, it belonged to the Whitmore Family Trust, established by her grandfather in 1958 when he bought the land as an investment. The same land that her grandmother had lovingly tended, growing apples and vegetables that she'd sold at the local farmer's market until she passed away 5 years ago. Mrs. Whitmore, HOA President Richard Blackwood, had said during her first board meeting appearance, his voice dripping with condescension, "I understand you're upset, but these homes have been here for 3 years. People have invested their life savings. Surely you can see reason." Karen had placed the surveyor's report on the table with deliberate precision. "Mr. Blackwood, I can see perfectly well. What I see is that your development company bought land from the city that the city didn't own. What I see is forged transfer documents and bribed inspectors. What I see is theft." The room had erupted. 35 homeowners, all suddenly realizing their investments might be worthless, all pointing fingers at Karen as if she were the villain in this story. Mrs. Henderson had been the loudest, screeching about property values and how Karen was trying to destroy the neighborhood out of spite. "You've always been jealous of our success," Mrs. Henderson had shouted, her face red with rage. "You can't stand that we have nice things while you're stuck in that little ranch house with your tacky garden." That's when Karen had made her first mistake. She'd laughed. "Jealous?" she'd said, standing up slowly. "Mrs. Henderson, your house is built on my land. You're not successful, you're squatters. And in 6 months, when I've exhausted every legal option, I'm going to take back what's mine." The threat had seemed empty at the time. Karen had believed the courts would sort everything out, that justice would prevail, that the truth would set everyone free. She'd been naive. 3 months of legal battles had taught her that the truth was expensive, justice was slow, and power belonged to whoever had the most money and the best lawyers. The HOA had hired a firm that specialized in property disputes. Karen had a solo practitioner who worked out of a strip mall. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," her lawyer had said during their last meeting, "but they're claiming adverse possession. Since the houses have been there for 3 years without challenge, they're arguing they have legal right to the land." Karen had stared at him in disbelief. "They stole my land and built on it illegally. How is that not challenged?" "Because your grandmother never filed a complaint. Because the city records showed the land was sold legitimately. Because proving forgery is nearly impossible when the original documents have been lost in a clerical error." That night, Karen had sat in her kitchen, staring at the photo of her grandmother's apple orchard that hung above the sink. In the background, she could see Sunset Lake, fed by the dam her grandfather had helped build as part of a Depression-era public works project. The same dam that controlled the water level for the entire basin. The same dam that Karen, as the primary landowner in the area, had maintenance rights to. "Mark," she'd said quietly, "I need you to take the kids and visit your mother for a few days."